Hot mic, hot mic. Glad to see every one of you out tonight. What a pleasure it is to be back in front of you tonight as we pick up where we left off last week in our series of lessons that we've entitled, Tell Me the Story of Jesus, trying to look at the grand, great big picture of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation and how it all fits together. And we had a great start last week looking from really the creation of the world to the flood. And tonight we're going to dive into some of the most amazing characters that we read about in the Bible. Three incredible people by the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because when Adam and Eve rebelled against God, we know what happened. We know that He had to escort them out of the perfect place that He had intended for them to enjoy. But even though He had to give them the consequences for their actions, God didn't give up on the vision of doing life with the people that He had created. And when Adam and Eve's descendants chose to ignore God in favor of their own selfish desire, yes, God had to give them the punishment for their choices. And He wiped them off the face of the earth with a great flood, sparing one man, a righteous man named Noah and his family. But even after Noah and his sons disappointed God time and time again with their behavior after the flood, God promised never to repeat that event of a worldwide flood. And even though He knew that people would be inclined toward evil and that the world would never be the perfect place He envisioned for mankind to enjoy, He still never gave up on His people. He decided instead to try a different approach. God's original vision was to come down and live in perfect harmony and in perfect fellowship with us. That's what Eden was all about. But the first humans chose to follow their own agendas instead of God's and broke that direct connection that God had with His creation. But rather than giving up on us again, God wasn't about to abandon us. He decided that the best way to continue His grand vision of community was to establish a nation, a special group of people that He could work with and that He could be with. People who were like-minded, who were intent on knowing God as much as God wanted to know them. This was the new plan of God. And through this special nation, God would reveal Himself to everyone, and He would offer a plan to draw all of mankind back to Himself, returning them to relationship with Him. All other nations would be able to watch God's special involvement with this new community, and they would be drawn to know Him as the one true God, and would have an opportunity to join in what He was doing with Israel. This new nation that God would build would be His way of saying, I want to return to you, and I want you to return to me so that we can experience the very best of life together. Because it's always been God's intention to dwell with His people. And it's at this point in the story that we meet an incredible man named Abram. Abram is called by God to leave everything he knows and go to a land that God would show him. And I know this has been brought out before, but think about how incredibly difficult that would be. I want you to get up and move away from everything that you know and understand, and when I tell you to stop, go ahead and stop there. Without any knowing of where he was going, Abram gets up and does what God wanted. He obeyed Him, and he went. And what I love about Abram, who God renames Abraham, is that everywhere he goes, he leaves behind a trail of altars, places of worship to Almighty God. If you look at Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7, you see him making an altar there. You look to Genesis 13 verse 18, and you see another altar. And all the way through the life and accounts of Abraham and the story of the Bible, what we see is altar after altar after altar, where he worships and he calls on the name of the Lord God. And it's because of Abram's faithfulness that God creates a threefold covenant with him. It's a covenant I'm sure you've heard about before. It's the nation, land, seed promise. So, number one, He would make out of Abraham's descendants a great nation. We know that He would also, out of Abraham and his descendants, give them this fantastically big land. And ultimately, it was through his descendants that God would bless all nations. And this promise that God gave to Abraham was not just given to him, but also to his son and to his grandson, two incredible patriarchs that we know as Isaac and Jacob. Isaac was born to Abraham and his wife Sarah when he was 100 years old. God showing again his power. And Sarah was way past the age of having a child at the age of 90. And God showed Abraham not only his faithfulness, but his power time and time and time again in his life. And Abraham followed God, not perfectly, but he followed God all the days of his life. I want to turn your attention to Genesis chapter 25. Because in Genesis chapter 25, what we have is a struggle that is going to dominate the story of the Bible for the next 8 or 9 chapters. Isaac's wife, the only son of Abraham, the son of promise anyway, of Abraham, Isaac's wife Rebekah is pregnant with twins. And Scripture says that these twins within her womb are struggling with each other inside her very belly. They are caught in a wrestling match before they're even born. Now, we understand kids like to wrestle. They like to horse around and do those kind of things, right? Well, these two are doing it in the womb. And Rebekah doesn't understand what's going on. And so the Lord comes to her and says, listen, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And when Esau is born first, Jacob, we know, is clinging to his heel. And what happens in the next 8 chapters is like a WWF wrestling match. Let's get ready to rumble, because that's what's going on here. Where's that Michael? I can't remember his name that does the let's get ready to rumble. If that was such a thing back then, we would have seen it right here in these 8 chapters that follow Genesis chapter 25. In this corner, weighing in at 225 pounds, is the hairy man, red man named Esau. And in this other corner is the pretty boy, the mama's boy, the deceiver, and the supplanter himself, Jacob. So Jacob and Esau are in the middle of this amazing struggle. And here's just a few of the things that take place in the middle of this wrestling match. Jacob, first and foremost, wrestles away Esau's birthright for a bowl of lentil soup. Now, I don't know if you like lentils, but I can't imagine giving away my birthright for something like that. I'm just going to be very, very honest with you. But that's what he does. He despises his birthright, thinks nothing of it, gives it away. Esau gladly takes that birthright for himself, and the wrestling match begins. If you know the story, Jacob is a mama's boy. Jacob is mom's favorite. And Esau is daddy's favorite, which is a whole nother lesson that we need to have. A lot of parenting lessons today that we could have, right? Shouldn't have favorites as parents, right? And so anyway, here they are wrestling. It adds to the struggle. His son, her son, and all that goes on with that. The wrestling match kind of notches up one as Jacob, not just wrestling with his brother, but decides to wrestle with his own father. And he steals Esau's blessing. Remember, he dresses up as a hairy guy, and he comes into the presence of his father who's blind or near blind, and he has sheepskin on his arms, and he says, I've come for my blessing. And his dad says, well, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the skin, this is Esau. And so Jacob steals Esau's blessing, and this is where it turns really ugly. As the story continues to unfold, Jacob runs for his life from Esau, and he ends up at his mom's brother's place. And that's there that he meets Rachel. And he falls in love. But Laban deceives the deceiver and gives him his older daughter Leah instead of Rachel to marry, who he had to work 7 years for. And his dad, Laban, says, hey, if you'll work another 7 years, I'll give you the other daughter too. And there's this struggle that's going on there. There's this wrestling match that's taking place. And then there's this wrestling match between the two wives, the daughters of Laban. One is able to bear children because really Jacob doesn't really want Leah. He wants Rachel, but yet there she is. And so God allows her to bear children. And Rachel, on the other hand, is barren. She's not able to have any children. And she's getting frustrated because it's all about family and it's all about land in those day and times, as we talked about last week. And finally, she's able to conceive, and there's this wrestling match. And when they're done having children, handmaidens get involved, and it gets really, really strange. And if that weren't enough, we find the wrestling match come to an ultimate conclusion in Genesis 32 between Jacob and God himself. We know the story. Jacob is on his way home He's on his way home from Laban's house to come back to his land when he encounters his brother Esau. And what he does is he sends everybody across the river to meet his brother first, because he's not sure how his brother's going to receive him. Is he still wanting to kill him? Is there still going to be problems? And he stays the night on the other side of the river, and it's there that a man, a godly man, the angel of the Lord, wrestles with him all night long. And it says this in verse 28, you shall no longer, Genesis 32:28, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Why is this so important? Why do I mention all of these struggles, all of this wrestling matches? I think it's a valid question and one that you should be asking. But here's why I think it's so important to stress these things tonight. Because I have to believe that if you're anything like me, and if your life is anything like mine, that you have your own wrestling matches going on. Can I get something from you on that? Maybe a weary, oh yeah. I mean, we have those things going on a regular basis. We wrestle with doubt. We wrestle with confusion. We wrestle with trials. We wrestle with decisions. I got you there. I can tell you all about that one. We wrestle with temptations. We wrestle in so many different ways with this thing called life. And there are times when we just get down to it that we think just doing things God's way seems foolish. It seems a little naive or out of touch with the rest of the world. And in the midst of these struggles and challenges, we may also sense that, man, God, I'm just not hearing from Him. God seems distant. God seems silent. And like Abraham's wife Sarah, we tend to become impatient and think that we need to help God out. And then there are those wrestling matches that we have within our own families, marital issues, children issues, work issues. So the question is, how do we handle these things when they come? Another way to ask it is this. This is the real question I want us to focus in on tonight. How do I wrestle with God and win? How do I wrestle with God and win? In order to answer that question, we're going to need to take a look at the life of Jacob and find out what caused him to be able to wrestle with God and win. And the first thing that I want you to see here in Genesis chapter 32, the first thing that Jacob has to do is he has to get himself alone with God. And if you're going to wrestle with God and win, I'm going to tell you, you're going to have to isolate yourself with God alone. You're going to have to spend some time away from the distractions, away from the noise, and get yourself together with God alone. Now, this isn't as easy as it seems. But just as God did with Jacob, sometimes God has to get us alone with Him in order to get our attention. Look at Jacob before this wrestling match. There's no Rachel, there's no Leah, there's no herds, there's no bargaining power, there's no leverage, there's no money, there's no possessions. Everything that he owns is on the other side of the river. God finally, at this moment, has Jacob where He's wanted him for years, alone. He is removed from the preoccupation. He's removed from the distractions. And if we're going to wrestle with God and win, we're going to need to do the same. We're going to need to learn how to spend some alone time with God. How you doing with that? Probably as good as I am, which didn't vary. We're going to need to spend some alone time with God. You see, we need to know who we are wrestling with. We too need to get away from the preoccupations and the distractions that continually get in our way. If we're being honest, life is crazy, huh? I mean, life is sometimes just overwhelming, and it can be so busy, and it seems never to slow down, only to ratchet itself up even more. And it was this way with Jacob, and it's no different for us. And so when was the last time in the middle of one of your wrestling matches that you have going on that you just stopped and you poured out your lives to God? You just said, God, I don't know what to do with this anymore. I don't know how to handle this. Now, we can come to the conclusion that we need to spend time alone with God, which is the best way to do it. Because, listen, if we don't come to that conclusion on our own, if we continue to refuse that time with God, sometimes God's going to put you in situations in your life that are going to force you to get alone with Him, just like He does with Jacob. And it is in this alone time with God that we can finally begin to get a glimpse of His power. That we can finally begin to understand His love and His desire for us. It is in that alone time that we get a glimpse of the lengths that God is willing to go to bring us back to Him. The question is, how far will you go to be with Him? We've seen what He'll do to be with us. How far will you go to be with Him? You want to wrestle with God and win, you're going to have to learn how to spend some alone time with God. And if that means taking certain things off your plate, then you better be willing to do it, because if you don't, He's going to get you alone one way or the other. Better to go ahead and get there yourself than to let Him be in control of what that looks like. Here's the second thing that we're going to need to do if we want to wrestle with God and win. We've got to give up trying to win. Oh, that's hard. I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm a pretty competitive fella. I don't like to lose. You call it checkers. You call it, you want to do, little flicking things at the table that, you have to get it to land just on the edge before it falls off at dinner. I want to win. I always want to win. That's who I am. That's my mentality. But if we're going to wrestle with God and win, we're going to have to give that up. We're going to have to say, you know what? There's certain things that even when I win, I lose. So in the middle of this wrestling match that's going on, there's a whole lot of talk about names. If you've read the story lately, you know. Jacob comes and he's wrestling with this guy, this angel, and he says, okay, what's your name? You remember that in the story? And the ancients believed that if you could possess a God's name, that you could control him. And without the identity of a God, one had no way of using that God. But Jacob cannot control God. And this is the lesson that Jacob has to learn. And learn it he does. And that is why Jacob finally submits to God. Jacob's defiance has suddenly turned to reliance on God. Jacob, who's been trying to do things without the Lord as much as possible, in this moment of wrestling with Him, realizes how impossible it was for him to function without the Lord, and the thought of doing so now becomes appalling to Jacob. The result is that he would not let go of the angel. He could not let go of the angel. Jacob now clings to God for dear life. And when we wrestle with God, we too are confronted with our inability to defeat Him. We can't beat God. We can't win that one. When we trust ourselves, we're weak. When we trust God, that's when we're strong. And so we lose in order to win. Man, that's biblical, isn't it? Isn't that what the life of Jesus is all about? He loses in order to win. And this is a principle and a concept that is going to be continuous throughout the story of the Bible. If we want to be first, we become last. If we want to be great, we serve. We humble ourselves in order to be lifted up. We die to ourselves so that we can finally win. We lose in order to win. Take a look at this passage. We'll come back to Genesis 32 in a second. Luke chapter 22. I want you to notice verse 24 through 27. I want you to know as we read this that verse 26 is a clear reference back to Jacob and Esau. So keep that in mind as we read. Luke 22:24. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them would be regarded as the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves. You want to wrestle with God and win? You got to spend some alone time with Him, and you're going to have to give up this idea, this concept. You're going to have to stop trying to win. You lose to be successful. And finally, number 3, and this may be the biggest one of all, the hardest one of all, is we're going to have to change. I know we don't like that word. Change is difficult. Change is hard. Change is frustrating. Change is so much of that and so much more. But in the middle of this wrestling match, God says to Jacob, you will no longer be called a deceitful person. That's what his name meant, supplanter, deceiver. He says, instead, I'm going to change your name. I'm going to call you Israel, the exalted one, or God, one who struggles with God and wins. That's his new name. So he's gone from deceiver to one who struggles with God and wins. Talk about change. Now, we know that names in the Old Testament bore great significance because they were a reflection, as we said about Samson, either of the parent's dream for the child or because they were a reflection of the nature of that person. And Jacob was no exception. And so when God asks him what his name is, and Jacob says, "My name is Jacob," what God is doing is he's asking for an admission of who he was and what he really was. And when Jacob gives his name, he is admitting to being a grabber, a supplanter, and a deceiver. What's this mean? Jacob has decided to come clean about who he is. He's decided to come clean about himself. In the same way he decided to admit having arrived at the end of his own resources. And if we're going to wrestle with God and win, we've got to do the same. If we're going to wrestle with God and win, we've got to come to the end of ourselves. And when we do, we find out that the end of ourselves is the beginning of true and abundant life. Are you hearing me tonight? When we come to the end of ourselves, that's when we finally discover the beginning of true and abundant life. The very thing that many of us are trying to achieve without God can only be found when we get alone with God, when we give up trying to win, and we allow Him to change us from the inside out. I want you to see what happens after this wrestling match. Through his struggles and through this wrestling match, Jacob becomes a completely different person, and so must we. Genesis 33, verse 1. Listen to this. "And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. And so he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with all her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. And he himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother." Humility, something the deceiver never has done before in his life. Concession. Look at verse 8. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." And Jacob said, "No, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." And he urged him, and he took it. The arrogant, proud, do anything to get ahead, no matter who gets hurt in the process, bows in humility 7 times to his brother. In verse 11, Jacob basically says, "Take the blessing that I stole back." This is repentance to the nth degree. He can't give it all back, but he tries. Jacob is a changed man, and for the rest of his life, he's no longer going to deceive to try to get ahead. He will no longer take advantages of others to get ahead. Jacob, who's now called Israel, begins to live up to the calling of his life, to be the one who strives with God and wins. You see, listen to me now. If you take nothing else from tonight, take this. It is the change. It is this change that is the real test of whether or not we have wrestled with God and won. It's the change. That's the real test. It doesn't mean that we won't continue to struggle. It doesn't mean that there won't continue to be wrestling matches in your life and mine. But it does mean that nothing will keep our God from being with us and for us. And if God is for us, who can be against us? Let me finish with this. If you look back on the wrestling match between God and Jacob, here is why Jacob won. He won because he refused to let go of God. His hip is touched. It's out of socket. He's struggling. He's hurting. The angel finally says, "Let me go." And he says, "No. I'm just going to cling to you for dear life. I'm not going to let go. I can't win, but I'm not letting go. I'm not letting go." In spite of all the pain, in spite of being outmatched, he refused to let go of God. And may every single one of us sitting here today commit to the same thing. No matter what happens, I will not let go of God. May that be our mantra. May that be our goal in life. May that be the end of our being, that no matter what happens, I am going to cling to God with all that I have. because that's where true life is found. Let's stand together and sing. If we can help you, if we need prayers of this church, we invite you to come right now while we stand and sing.